The man who rode into Calhoun Flats on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1883 had three things to his name: a horse that wasn't his, a bedroll that had seen better decades, and a past that followed him like a shadow that refused to respect the angle of the sun. He came in from the east, which was unusual. Most drifters who found their way to the New Mexico territory came down from Colorado or up from Texas, but this one came from the east, and the people of Calhoun Flats noticed, because people in small territories always notice things like that. The town itself was not much to speak of: a main street with a general store, a livery, a saloon called the Red Spur, a church that was only half finished because the congregation kept arguing about the steeple, and a scattering of homesteads and small ranches spreading out into the mesa country beyond. It sat in a wide valley bowl where the red earth met a creek line of cottonwood trees, and on most days the wind came down off the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and reminded everyone exactly how small they were. Mabel Leland was behind the counter of Leland's General Store when the stranger's horse came past the front window. She was tallying a column of numbers in her ledger, her dark hair pinned back but escaping at the temples the way it always did by mid-morning, and she did not look up right away because strangers came through often enough. It was a trade route town, after all. People passed through. That was the nature of such places, but something made her look up. She could not have explained it. Maybe it was the particular sound of the horse, a tired, uneven cadence that suggested the animal had been pushed too hard for too long. Maybe it was some other instinct that a woman running a business alone in territory country developed out of pure necessity. Whatever it was, she looked up, and she saw the man through the wavy glass of the front window, and she watched him dismount outside the livery across the street. He was tall. He moved carefully, the way people moved when something hurt but they were determined not to show it. His coat was dark and travel-worn, his hat pulled low against the morning light, and even from across the street and through imperfect glass, Mabel could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the tension of a man expecting trouble. She watched him hand his horse to the livery boy, watched him say something and then step back and look up and down the street the way people did when they were taking inventory of a place. Counting exits, she thought, and then turned back to her ledger because it was not her business to count a stranger's exits for him. He came into the general store 20 minutes later. The bell above the door announced him, and Mabel looked up from her work the same way she looked up for every customer, with a professional pleasantness that she had spent years cultivating. He was younger than she had initially thought, somewhere in his late 20s, perhaps 28 or 29. His face was lean and angular, with a few days of dark beard and eyes that were a complicated shade somewhere between gray and green, the kind of eyes that seemed to be constantly evaluating things. There was a cut above his left eyebrow that was mostly healed but not entirely. There were shadows under his eyes that had nothing to do with the time of day. He stopped just inside the door and looked at her, and then looked at the store, and something about the way he did it systematically, carefully, like a man cataloging safe spaces, made her think again of exits. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he said. His voice was low and a little rough, like he hadn't used it much recently. He stepped to the counter slowly and looked at the things arranged behind her, the tins of coffee and tobacco, the bolts of calico fabric, the rows of canned goods. "I need some basic supplies. Coffee, flour, a tin of beans if you have them. Salt pork if it's reasonable." "All of it's reasonable," Mabel said pleasantly, and began pulling items. She set them on the counter and watched him from the corner of her eye the way she watched everyone, reading the small things. His clothes were not cheap, or had not been cheap when they were new. His boots were good leather. There was a quality to him that had been deliberately obscured under layers of road dust and exhaustion, like something deliberately buried. "You passing through?" she asked, which was not unusual. She asked everyone. It was how a merchant kept track of her potential customer base. "Haven't decided," he said. She looked at him directly then because that was an unusual answer. Most people knew exactly whether they were passing through or staying. "Well," she said, "if you're thinking of staying, there's a boarding house at the north end of the street. Mrs. Alderman runs it. She's strict about meal times and she does not allow drinking in the rooms, but the beds are clean." "Obliged," he said. She totaled his goods and told him the sum, and he paid her in coin without hesitation, exact change, which meant he'd been calculating in his head as she'd been adding things up. She noticed that too. She noticed most things. He picked up his parcel and moved toward the door and then stopped with his hand on the doorframe and turned back. He seemed to be deciding something. "I wonder," he said, "if you know of anyone looking to hire a hand. Ranch work, carpenter work, anything substantial." Mabel leaned on the counter. "What are you good at?" The question seemed to catch him off guard in a small way, like he'd expected a different response. He thought about it genuinely, which she appreciated. She had no patience for men who couldn't think genuinely about anything. "Horses," he said finally. "I'm good with horses, fencing, some carpentry. I'm a fair hand with a wagon repair. I know surveying." "Surveying," she said with interest. "That's uncommon." "I know," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Harlan Briggs runs the biggest cattle operation 3 miles east. He's always short of hands come spring. Ranching's seasonal work, though. If you want something more year-round, there's the Morrison homestead north of town. They're building and they could use a man who knows carpentry and fencing." He nodded, absorbing this. "Thank you," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that was not perfunctory. It was genuine and a little surprised, as though courtesy had not been his most frequent companion of late. He left, and the bell above the door swung quietly behind him, and Mabel watched through the window as he walked up the street with his parcel under one arm, and his eyes still doing that careful inventory of everything around him. She went back to her ledger and thought, without particularly meaning to, that she did not know his name. He had not offered it and she had not asked. That was unusual too. In Calhoun Flats, names were usually among the first things exchanged. His name was not something he carried easily. The name he'd been born with was Cole Hardesty, and for 28 years it had defined him in ways that had nothing to do with who he was and everything to do with who his family was. The Hardestys of eastern Kansas were not a gentle legacy. His father, Thomas Hardesty, had died in a prison in Leavenworth when Benjamin was 15. His older brothers, 2 of them, had spent years building a reputation in the territory for cattle theft, horse stealing, and at least one charge of armed robbery that had resulted in a 7-year sentence for the eldest. Benjamin had left Kansas at 19 with the explicit intention of becoming someone else entirely, and for several years he had managed it. He had worked surveying contracts in Colorado. He had done honest carpentry work in 3 different towns in New Mexico territory. He had kept his head down and his name quiet, and he had been, if not happy, at least free of the particular weight that the name Hardesty carried in certain parts of the frontier. And then his brother James had come looking for him. James Hardesty was not a man who accepted the idea that his family should be scattered. He had tracked Benjamin down in a town called Mesquite Wells in eastern New Mexico, had shown up drunk and violent, had caused enough of a scene that the local sheriff had come looking for anyone named Hardesty. Benjamin had left Mesquite Wells in the early hours of a morning in March with whatever he could carry, and a horse from the livery that the owner owed him wages for, but which would nonetheless look, on paper, like a theft. He had ridden west until he hit the Sangre de Cristo Range, and then south until he found Calhoun Flats. And when he had ridden into that small valley and smelled the cottonwood trees and the clean cold of the mountain air, he had felt something close to relief. He had thought, here, this might work. This might be the place where I stop running. But he had not given anyone his name because he did not know yet which name to give. He took a room at Mrs. Alderman's boarding house, just as Mabel had suggested. Mrs. Alderman was a small, sharp woman of about 60 who looked at him over the top of wire-rimmed spectacles and told him the rules clearly and without apology, which he respected. He signed her register. Where it asked for a name, he wrote Benjamin Doyle, which was his mother's maiden name, which was the only name he had ever thought of as his own. He rode out to the Morrison homestead the next day. The Morrisons were a young family, husband and wife in their early 30s, with 2 small children and an ambitious plan for a farm that kept outrunning their capacity to build it. Daniel Morrison shook his hand and asked if he could actually do what he said he could do, and Benjamin said he could, and Daniel Morrison said to come back Monday morning and they would find out. He worked at the Morrison place through April and into May, framing walls and setting fence posts and repairing the Morrison wagon, which had a broken axle and a wheel rim that had been inadequately patched by the previous man Daniel had hired. He was good at it, better than good, and Daniel Morrison was not a man who withheld his appreciation when work was done well. Benjamin also, when the Morrison work was light, hired out to Harlan Briggs's cattle operation, doing seasonal sorting and branding, and the kind of hard, physical range work that asked nothing of him except his body and his competence. He was good at that too. He was, above all things, good at keeping his head down and doing what needed to be done. He came into Leland's general store twice more in his first 2 weeks in Calhoun Flats, once for more supplies, and once because the Morrison children needed 2 pairs of good boots, and Daniel had sent him in to pick them up. Each time, the woman behind the counter greeted him with that same professional warmth that he had started to think of as distinctly hers, that quality of being genuinely present with whoever she was talking to without being intrusive about it. On his 3rd visit, she had a problem. He came in on a Wednesday afternoon in early May and found her on her knees behind the main counter, her head half inside a lower cabinet, cursing under her breath in a manner that was not compatible with the professional pleasantness she presented to customers. He stood at the counter and waited, and eventually she backed out of the cabinet and stood up and turned around and found him there, and for just a moment she looked startled and then she laughed. It was a good laugh, unself-conscious and genuine. "I beg your pardon," she said. "The shelf support for the lower cabinet has given way and half my canned goods are listing to one side, and I cannot for the life of me get the support back in place from the outside." "I can fix that," Benjamin said. She looked at him with an expression that was weighing something. "You sure?" "I do carpentry," he said, "among other things." She studied him for another second and then said, "All right," and stepped back from the counter to give him room. He came around the counter, which felt presumptuous, but she had invited it, and crouched down to look at the cabinet. The shelf support was a simple wooden cleat that had been inadequately nailed to begin with, and the nail had worked loose. He asked her if she had a hammer and a few finishing nails somewhere in stock, and she produced them from under the counter with the ease of someone who knew exactly where everything was at all times. He had the repair done in 10 minutes. When he stood up and handed back the hammer, she was watching him with her arms crossed and something thoughtful in her expression. "Thank you," she said. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing," he said. 10 minutes of work." She frowned at him, and it was a principled frown, the frown of a woman who kept careful accounts. "I don't take things for free," she said. "Then buy me a cup of coffee sometime," he said, and then was mildly surprised at himself for saying it, because it was the most forward thing he had said to anyone in Calhoun Flats. She seemed mildly surprised too, but not offended. She tilted her head to one side and looked at him with that direct, evaluating quality she had. "The Red Spur serves coffee in the mornings," she said. "I go there Sundays before the store opens. You're welcome to join me if you're around." "I'll be around," he said. He left the store and stood in the afternoon sun and thought that he had just made a social arrangement with someone for the first time in a very long time, and it felt complicated in ways he couldn't entirely account for. Sunday morning he came to the Red Spur at 8 o'clock and she was already there, at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee already poured, wearing a clean blue dress and with her hair properly pinned, though he noted that the temple pieces were already beginning to escape their pins, which he was starting to think was simply the natural state of things. "You came," she said, and there was something that might have been pleased surprise in her voice. I said I would, he said, and sat down. They talked for an hour and a half, which was longer than either of them had anticipated. She had a way of asking questions that were interested without being intrusive, and he found himself answering with more honesty than he had managed in quite some time. She asked about the Morrison work, and he told her about the fencing project. She asked about his surveying background, and he told her about Colorado. She did not ask him where he was from originally, which he appreciated so much it almost hurt. He learned that she was 26 years old and had been running the general store since her father had passed 3 years ago of a fever that had started as something minor and then simply wasn't. Her mother had died when Mabel was 12. She had a younger brother, Eli, who was 22 and worked on the Briggs cattle operation, and who she described with an affectionate exasperation that suggested a complicated but genuine closeness. She had come to Calhoun Flats as a child and had no intention of leaving. The store was hers. The building was hers. Her father had built it when he had come to the territory 15 years before, and she ran it alone and ran it well. He noticed she did not say there was anyone helping her run it. He noticed she did not mention anyone who might have that role or have had it. He filed this away without attaching too much significance to it. You haven't told me your name, she said, near the end of their coffee. He had been expecting this eventually. He picked up his cup and looked at it and set it down again and said, carefully, Benjamin Doyle. She waited a moment, and he had the strange sensation that she was listening to the way he had said it, not just to the name itself. She had that kind of ear. He could tell. Benjamin, she said, trying it out. Is that what people call you? It's what I'd like people to call me, he said, which was truer than the way he normally answered that question, and he was not entirely sure why he'd said it that way. She looked at him with those steady dark eyes, and there was something in her expression that was careful and kind and completely undemanding. Then Benjamin it is, she said simply, and picked up her coffee cup, and that was all. No follow-up questions, no curious press. Just a straightforward acceptance that you could choose what you were called, and that choosing was entirely your right. He sat very still for a moment and felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been wound tight for so long he had stopped noticing the constant tension of it. Thank you, he said, and meant it in more ways than he could account for at a coffee table on a Sunday morning. She smiled at him, and it was the first full smile he had seen from her, not the professional pleasantness but the real thing, and it rearranged something in his understanding of her completely. He thought about that smile for several days afterward. May deepened into June, and Calhoun Flats warmed, and the cottonwood trees along the creek went fully green, and the territory spread out around the town in its enormous, silent, red-and-gold beauty, and Benjamin Doyle settled into the place the way water finds its level, gradually and without ceremony. He worked for the Morrisons 3 days a week and Harlan Briggs 2 days, and on Saturdays he did odd repairs around the town, a broken shutter here, a wagon wheel there, the kind of work that accumulated in a place like Calhoun Flats and that nobody had the time or skill to get to promptly. People paid him fairly, and he saved the money carefully, and did not spend it on drink or gambling, which made him notable among the working men of the town in a way that was mildly embarrassing. He did not seek attention. It found him anyway. He and Mabel had coffee on 3 more Sunday mornings through June, and each time the conversation went longer and ranged further. They talked about things that mattered, about what it was like to grow up in the territory versus somewhere else, about the particular loneliness of small places and the particular comfort of them, about what it meant to stay somewhere and what it cost, about books they had read, because she kept a small shelf of them in the store's back room and lent them out to townspeople who asked, and he had read more than she'd expected him to. Where did you get your education? She asked one morning, and it was one of those questions that pointed toward the territory he still hadn't fully opened up. I taught myself a good deal of it, he said. I had a few years of schooling as a child. "A teacher in Colorado who let me use his library." She nodded and did not press, and he found himself wanting to tell her more than he had. It was a strange want. He had spent years being careful about what he said and to whom, and this woman with her escaping hairpins and her principled refusal to take things for free made him want to simply say everything out loud, which was alarming in its way. He had a complication that he had not fully resolved, which was the matter of the horse from the livery in Mesquite Wells. He had left wages behind him there, genuine wages he was owed, but the horse was technically not his to take, and he knew it. He had been sending money by post to the livery owner in Mesquite Wells, a cautious amount each month, enough that by the end of July the balance would be more than settled. He was careful about this. He was building something that he did not want undermined by anything unresolved from before. Mabel's brother Eli came into the store one Saturday morning, while Benjamin was there picking up supplies, and the introduction was brisk in the way that introductions between men often were. Eli Leland was lean and dark-haired like his sister, but where she was settled and certain, he was still finding his edges. He was 22 and cocky in the way that young men on cattle operations sometimes were, which was not malicious, but needed to be met with patience. He looked at Benjamin with the particular assessment that brothers applied to men who were spending time with their sisters, even if the spending of time had been entirely proper. "Morrison's man," Eli said, which was how people in town identified Benjamin in the absence of any stronger identification. "Among other things," Benjamin said, which was also how he answered it, and Eli's eyes sharpened a little with something that might have been genuine curiosity. They ended up talking for 40 minutes while Mabel restocked shelves and listened with that listening quality she had, that way of being present in a room without demanding to be its center. Eli wanted to know about surveying, because he had heard from Daniel Morrison that Benjamin knew the work and Eli had a half-formed idea about whether the territory lands north of town were properly mapped. They talked about survey lines and legal descriptions, and the complicated reality of land claiming in the New Mexico territory, where the old Spanish land grants crossed with newer American legal frameworks in ways that created genuine confusion and genuine injustice in equal measure. Benjamin knew about this from direct experience. In Colorado, he had done survey work that had been used to challenge homesteaders' claims, and he had come to feel deeply uncomfortable about it, about the way that technical knowledge could be weaponized against the people who had worked land for years or for generations. He said so plainly, which made Eli look at him with more respect than he had started with. "Mabel said you were worth knowing," Eli said, as he was leaving. Benjamin looked at her, and she was arranging tins on a shelf with her back to them, and he could see the back of her neck go slightly pink. "She has good judgment," he said carefully. Eli left, and the store was quiet, and Mabel kept arranging tins with more attention than they required. "You said that," Benjamin said. "I say lots of things," she said, still with her back to him. "That you said that particular thing," he said, "about me." She turned around then, with 2 tins in her hands and her expression composed but her color still higher than usual. "You came in here and fixed my shelf without being asked and charged me nothing for it," she said. "And you're kind to Daniel Morrison's children, which I have observed. And you know your surveying law and you're honest about where it goes wrong. Those are worth knowing. I didn't say anything remarkable." He looked at her for a moment. "To me it was remarkable," he said. The space between them in the store felt different for a moment. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the morning light came through the front windows and made the dust motes visible, and outside on the main street a horse went by and someone called out to someone else, and all of it felt very far away. "You should take your supplies," she said finally. "I have stock to count." "Yes," he said, and picked up his parcel and left, and walked out into the summer street and stood in the heat for a moment and thought that something had shifted, and he was not sure what to do about it. He did not do anything about it immediately, because there were things he needed to resolve first. He wrote a longer letter to the livery owner in Mesquite Wells with the last of what he owed, and he kept working, and he kept saving his money, and he tried to think clearly about what it meant to begin to care about a person and a place when he had spent years specifically not doing either of those things. The complication arrived in early July on the afternoon stage. Benjamin was at the Morrison homestead when it came, so he did not see it happen directly, but he heard about it that evening from Mrs. Alderman, who heard everything that moved through Calhoun Flats within hours of its moving. A man had come in on the stage asking questions. He had gone first to the sheriff's office, which was a small operation run by a capable man named Walter Cobb, who handled the usual range of territory troubles, land disputes, the occasional drunk and disorderly, a rustling problem that came and went with the seasons. The man from the stage had asked Sheriff Cobb if anyone by the name of Hardesty had come through recently. Mrs. Alderman told Benjamin this over supper at her long table with the 7 other boarders, and she said it in the general way of local news, not directed at him, and he sat and ate his beef and potatoes and kept his expression neutral, and felt the old cold tension settle back into his chest like it had never left. He did not sleep well that night. In the morning he went to the store early, before it opened, and knocked on the side door that led to the small office and living quarters that Mabel kept behind the main floor. She answered in a day dress that she hadn't quite finished buttoning, with her hair actually still fully down, which was the first time he had seen it that way, and it was long and dark and fell to the middle of her back, and he had the thought that she was beautiful in a way that he did not have the vocabulary for at 7 in the morning while trying to think about something serious. She looked at him with an immediate reading of his face that was more accurate than he was comfortable with. "Come in," she said. He came into her small back office and stood with his hat in his hands, and she leaned against her desk and crossed her arms and waited, and he told her. Not all of it, not the full history of the Hardesty name and everything that came with it, but the essential facts. That there was a name he had come west trying to leave behind. That the name had found him once already and he had moved on. That a man had come in on yesterday's stage asking questions, and that if that man was connected to what he was running from, he needed to know if he was going to bring trouble to a town he had come to care about. She listened to the whole of it without interrupting him, which was one of the things he had come to value most about her. She had the capacity to simply hold what someone was saying without inserting herself into the middle of it, and it was rarer than it should have been. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the floor. Then she looked up. "This name you're running from," she said. "Is it yours by right, or is it someone else's?" He thought about that. "It's my birth name," he said, "but it belongs more to my family's reputation than to me. I've never done what they're known for. I want that to be clear." "I believe you," she said simply, and again that directness, that uncomplicated acceptance, went through him like something warm. "The man on the stage might be a bounty hunter," he said. "There was a warrant issued for James Hardesty, not for me, but those things have a way of broadening." She was quiet again, thinking, then she straightened up from her desk. "Sheriff Cobb is a fair man," she said. "He grew up in the territory. He knows that a name is not a character. Not all lawmen think that way." "No," she agreed, "but Walter Cobb does. I've known him 15 years. She paused. "I think you should talk to him, not about the Hardesty name specifically, but about your situation. He doesn't have to know your birth name to understand that you're here honest and working honest." Benjamin turned his hat in his hands. "You make it sound simple." "I didn't say it was simple," she said. "I said it was the right thing to do." She paused and something softened slightly in her expression. "You came here to build something, didn't you? Not just to hide." He met her eyes. "Yes." "Then start building it properly," she said. "Hiding is only half a plan." He thought about that for a long moment. Outside the side window the morning was brightening, and somewhere up the street a dog was barking at something, and the ordinary life of the town was asserting itself. And he thought, "This is what I want. This exact ordinary life, in this exact town, with this particular woman looking at him with that particular directness." "All right," he said. He went to see Sheriff Cobb that afternoon. Walter Cobb was a man of 50 with a gray mustache and the patient eyes of someone who had seen most of what the territory could produce. He listened to Benjamin's account with his hands folded on his desk, and he asked a few precise questions, and at the end of it he said, "The man who came in on the stage is named Rickard. He's a bail enforcer out of Dodge City. The warrant is for James Hardesty on a charge of robbery and assault." "The warrant is specific to James. Are you James?" "No," Benjamin said. "Are you kin to James Hardesty?" A pause. "By birth, not by choice." Cobb looked at him steadily. "I've got no warrant for anyone named Benjamin Doyle," he said. "And I've got 2 employers in this town who will speak to your character, which I already know because Morrison told me last week that you were the best hand he'd hired in 3 years. He leaned forward slightly. "I will tell Rickard that I have no one matching the description of James Hardesty in this town, because I don't. What I do have is a man named Benjamin Doyle who works hard and pays his bills and doesn't cause trouble." Benjamin exhaled slowly. "I'm grateful." "Don't thank me yet," Cobb said. "Rickard is thorough. He may ask around town. People may tell him things. I can't control what people say. But I can tell you that as far as this office is concerned, Benjamin Doyle is who you are, and that is what this office will act on." "That's fair," Benjamin said. "One more thing," Cobb said. He picked up a pen and tapped it against the desk. "That horse you came in on. I've been in this business long enough to know the difference between a stolen horse and a borrowed one. If there's a matter to be settled there, I'd recommend settling it before Rickard decides to look in that direction." Benjamin said, "It's already settled. The livery owner in Mesquite Wells has been paid in full." Cobb set down his pen. "Then we have no problems," he said, and stood up and extended his hand, and Benjamin shook it. The bail enforcer named Rickard stayed in town 2 more days and asked questions and got answers that confirmed there was no James Hardesty in Calhoun Flats, and on the 3rd morning he was gone on the westbound stage. And Benjamin stood on the porch of Mrs. Alderman's boarding house and watched it go, and felt the last of the cold tension in his chest begin to fully dissolve. He went directly to the general store. Mabel was behind the counter with a customer, a rancher's wife named Helena Briggs, who was selecting yard goods with the focused attention of someone commissioning a painting. Benjamin waited near the door with his hat, and when Helena Briggs finally concluded her selection and departed with a bolt of blue checked cloth, Mabel looked at him across the store and he smiled at her. It was the first full, uncalculated smile he had offered anyone in Calhoun Flats, and she saw what it meant immediately, and something in her own face answered it before she could compose herself back to professional pleasantness. "He's gone," Benjamin said. "I know," she said. "Helena Briggs told me just now. She has excellent intelligence." She paused. "I'm glad." "Mabel," he said, and stopped. She waited. "You told me to start building properly," he said, "not just hiding." "I think you were right. I think I've been approaching this the wrong way entirely." "The wrong way?" she said carefully. He came to the counter and put his hands on it, not leaning on it but resting them there, close enough to her that the space between them felt meaningful. "I came here keeping everything at arm's length," he said. "The town, the work, the people. Because I thought if I didn't hold too tightly to anything it would be easier to leave again when I had to. But the thing is," he stopped, "I don't want to leave, and I think I've been holding things at arm's length specifically to avoid admitting that." She looked at him, and her expression was very still and very attentive. "I'd like to court you," he said, "if that's something you'd consider, properly and honestly, which means I'm telling you plainly what I want and giving you the full truth of who I am at the same time." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the street sounds continued their indifferent narration. A gust of wind moved the sign above the door. "Tell me the rest of it," she said. "Not what I need to know, what you want to tell me." So he did. He told her about growing up with Thomas Hardesty for a father, and what that meant. About the specific shape of growing up in a house where the law was the enemy and honesty was a liability, and the name you were born with was already a mark against you before you'd done a thing to deserve it. He told her about leaving Kansas at 19 with nothing but the determination to be someone different, about the years of building something careful and solid, and then having it collapse the moment James found him. About riding west in the dark in March with a horse he hadn't quite earned yet, and not knowing where he was going. He told her about riding into Calhoun Flats and seeing the cottonwood trees and feeling, for the first time in years, like he might have found the place where he could stop. She listened to all of it with her hands folded on the counter and her eyes on his face, and when he finished she did not say anything for a moment. The afternoon had gotten long and golden around them. The dust motes moved in the light. "Benjamin," she said finally, "I asked you what name you wanted the first time you told me your name. Do you remember?" "I remember," he said. "You said Benjamin Doyle," she said. "Not Hardesty, you chose, and you've been living by that choice every day since you rode in here. That's not nothing. That's everything, actually." He looked at her and thought he might embarrass himself if he wasn't careful, which was not a feeling he was accustomed to. "So," she said, and she unfolded her hands and put them flat on the counter closer to his, not touching but deliberately close. "I will consider being courted by Benjamin Doyle, who I have known for 2 months and whom I find to be honest and capable and considerably more interesting than most of the men in this county." "That's a generous standard," he said, and she laughed. It was that laugh again, the real one, and hearing it this close to him was something else entirely. The courtship of Benjamin Doyle and Mabel Leland was conducted in the manner of its time and place, which meant in public in the presence of other people, with a deliberateness that was both socially required and genuinely felt. He walked with her to Sunday service, though she was more faithful about it than he was, and he came initially more for the walking with her than for the service itself, which she found out and found amusing. He took supper on Sunday evenings at Mrs. Alderman's boarding house, and Mabel began to appear at those suppers, which Mrs. Alderman approved of with an almost aggressive enthusiasm. He brought her small things, not expensive things because he was still building his savings, and she would not have accepted expensive things anyway, but thoughtful ones. A book he had come across in the town of Cimarron when he went with Daniel Morrison to file paperwork at the county seat. A piece of turquoise he had found in the creek bed, an unusual find, which she thought was beautiful and put on the shelf behind the store counter where she could see it while she worked. Once, when she mentioned that the window frame on the store's west wall was letting in drafts, he came on a Saturday afternoon and receipted the frame and putty sealed it, and refused to accept anything for it. And she did not argue this time, only brought him coffee while he worked and stood in the golden afternoon light while they talked, and he thought that this was the best hour he had spent in years. They talked every chance they had, which was not as many chances as either of them would have preferred. She ran a business. He worked long hours. The territory did not arrange itself around romance. But in the evening sometimes, when the store closed and the day's work was finished, he would come and sit on the steps of the store's front porch, and she would sit in the doorway, and they would watch the last light go off the mesa to the west and talk, or sometimes not talk, and that was as good as the talking. He told her once, on one of those evenings, that he had thought for a long time that he couldn't afford to want things. That wanting things made you vulnerable to losing them, and that he had spent years systematically reducing what he allowed himself to want until the list was very short. "And now," she said quietly, "now the list is longer," he said, looking at the mesa. "What's on it?" she said. He turned to look at her. She was backlit by the last light, and there was something in her expression that was very open and a little uncertain, which was the first time he had seen uncertainty in her, and it made him understand that she had her own careful places, her own closed-off territories, her own ways of managing what she allowed herself to want. "You know what's on it," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "Yes, I think I do." He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the step beside her, and she turned her hand and held his. And they sat like that while the light finished leaving the sky, and the first stars came out over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. and it was the simplest and most complete thing that had happened to either of them in a very long time. Eli Leland's reaction to the developing situation between his sister and Benjamin Doyle was, after an initial period of watchful suspicion, one of genuine approval. This did not come easily. Eli had 3 years of watching Mabel manage everything alone, watching her hold the store together after their father's death, watching her navigate the specific hardships of a woman running a business in territory country, where you had to be twice as capable as any man to be taken half as seriously. He was protective in the deeply principled way of someone who has watched someone they love go unrecognized for too long. He came to the Briggs Ranch one September morning when Benjamin was there for the late-season branding work, and he worked alongside him through the long, hot hours. And at the midday break he said, without preamble, "Mabel doesn't say things she doesn't mean." Benjamin looked at him. "I know that," he said. "She said something about you," Eli said, which echoed what he had said before back at the start of the summer. In July, when that bail enforcer was in town. She came to supper at Briggs's bunkhouse, which she never does, and she sat there all evening like she was listening for something, like she was waiting to hear what was going to happen. I've never seen her like that, not even when Pa died. Benjamin was quiet. "So I'm telling you," Eli said, "that I've got no quarrel with you. But she is the most important person in my life, and if you give her cause to sit up nights listening for bad news, we'll have a different kind of conversation." "That's fair," Benjamin said. "I'd expect nothing less." Eli nodded and went back to his work, and that, in the manner of men in that time and place, was the end of the conversation and also the beginning of something that would, over the following months, become a genuine friendship. September brought the autumn colors to the cottonwood trees along the creek, and the air came off the mountains with a new sharpness, and the town settled into its fall rhythms, laying in wood and stock for the winter. Benjamin finished the last of the Morrison building work, and Daniel Morrison shook his hand and paid him generously, and said he'd have work again come spring without being asked, which was the best kind of employment offer, the unprompted kind. He had saved enough money by September to move out of Mrs. Alderman's boarding house, and into a small adobe he had rented on the south end of the main street, which needed work but which had good bones and a fine view of the mesa from the back. He spent October and November fixing it up properly, not just patch repairs but real work, replastering the walls and rehanging the doors and building proper shutters that would handle the winter wind. He cut firewood and stacked it. He made the place, in every deliberate way he could manage, into somewhere that someone could stay. He and Mabel had their first serious disagreement in November, which was itself a kind of landmark because it meant they had become important enough to each other to disagree seriously. It was about the store. She had been approached by a man named Garrett Hale, who ran a supply operation out of Santa Fe, and who had offered to buy the Leland store outright, or alternatively to take a half-ownership stake in exchange for expanded supply lines and the working capital to expand the floor space. The offer was financially significant. Mabel had been weighing it for 2 weeks without telling Benjamin, and when she finally mentioned it, he made the mistake of responding with an opinion before he'd asked enough questions. "Don't," he said immediately. She looked at him over her coffee cup with an expression that he recognized as the fully serious one without the warmth. "I beg your pardon." He knew immediately that he'd gotten the approach wrong. "I mean," he started. "I know what you mean," she said. "I'm asking you to reconsider how you said it." He set down his cup and looked at the table and thought about this. "You're right," he said. "That wasn't my decision to offer an opinion on before you told me your own thinking." She looked at him steadily. "Tell me what you actually think, but say it properly." "I think Garrett Hale will not be a good partner," he said. "I've seen his operation in Santa Fe. He is not dishonest, but he is not particularly principled, and he cares about his margin above most other things. I think a half-ownership arrangement with someone like that would give you capital but cost you control, and control is what makes this store yours." She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her thinking. "Also," he said more quietly. "Your father built that building. You built the business in it since he died. Handing half of it to a man from Santa Fe who didn't do either of those things seems like the wrong direction." She looked at him with an expression that had moved back toward warmth. "Those were the right things to say," she said, "and said properly. I'll try to do that more consistently." "You do it quite consistently already," she said. "You just had a moment." She paused. "I had already decided not to take the offer. But I wanted to think it through with someone." He looked at her. "You have me for that," he said. "For thinking things through, that's what I'm here for." She smiled at him across the table, and it was the full smile, and the November morning light came through the saloon windows and made everything warm, and he thought he had never been so certain of anything in his life as he was of being in this town with this woman. He asked her father's question in December. He had nothing left of her father to ask, which he had thought about carefully, and which he had decided meant he should ask the person who had kept things going since. He asked Eli. He went to the bunkhouse at the Briggs operation on a Sunday afternoon in early December and found Eli alone there, mending tack with the focused patience of someone who had done it 1,000 times. He sat down across from him and said directly, because he had learned from Mabel that directness was both the kindest and most effective approach, "I'd like to ask your sister to marry me. I want to ask you first." Eli put down the leather strap he was working and looked at him for a long, unhurried moment. The bunkhouse was quiet. Outside, the wind was moving through the canyon to the north with a low sound. "Can you take care of her?" Eli said. "I can provide for her and I will work hard to do it," Benjamin said. "But she doesn't need taking care of in the way you mean. She's been taking care of herself and of you and the store for 3 years. Eli looked at him with something shifting in his expression. "That's the right answer," he said. "It's the honest one," Benjamin said. "Those are usually the same thing with you," Eli said, and extended his hand. He asked Mabel on a Wednesday evening in December when the first real snow of the winter was coming down outside, and the store was closed, and she was doing her year-end accounting at the big desk in the back room, and he came and sat across from her and waited for her to finish her column, because interrupting her columns was not something he was prepared to do. She finished the column and looked up with the abstracted expression of someone coming back from numbers to the present moment and found him sitting across from her with his hands folded on the desk, and she read his expression and went very still. "Mabel," he said. "Yes," she said. He almost laughed. "I haven't asked yet." "I know," she said, "but yes." "Mabel Leland," he said, and he reached across the desk and unfolded his hands and put them over hers. "You asked me the first day what name I wanted to go by, and you've called me by it every day since without once making me feel like I was carrying something I shouldn't. You made me feel like a man who had a right to choose who he was. I have never been given that before, and I have thought about it every day since, and I think about you every day, and I want to spend every day after this doing the same. Will you marry me?" She looked at him with her eyes bright and her expression entirely unguarded, which was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, the total absence of the professional composure, just her, plain and honest and present. "Yes," she said again. "I already said yes." "You did," he said, and he laughed and she laughed, and the snow came down outside the store window, and the lamp on her desk made everything gold. They were married in April 1884, a year and 1 month after he had ridden into Calhoun Flats on a tired horse and walked into her store and let her fix his name. The wedding was in the church, which had finally gotten its steeple resolved in favor of a simple wooden cross that the whole congregation had agreed was more honest than ornate. Mabel wore her mother's white dress, which she had altered herself, and which was simple and perfectly suited to her. Benjamin wore a dark coat that Mrs. Alderman had pressed for him, with an expression of intense personal satisfaction. Eli stood up with Benjamin because there was no one else Benjamin would have asked, and the selection of a best man had been arrived at with an ease that reflected how much had changed in the year since Benjamin had come to town. Sheriff Cobb sat in the third pew. The Morrisons were there with their children. Helena Briggs came and wept throughout in the way of women who are moved by weddings as a category regardless of the specific participants. The whole congregation of the small church was there, and the town of Calhoun Flats stood up collectively for Mabel Leland and the man she had decided to marry. And it was, in every way, a celebration of a life being properly chosen. Reverend James Alderman, who was no relation to Mrs. Alderman but who had a gift for ceremony that was gentle and not ponderous, married them with words that were neither long nor hollow. When he said the part about names, about taking each other's names and making them your own, he did not know that there was a particular weight in that for the two people standing before him, but Mabel's hand tightened in Benjamin's and he felt it, and he pressed back, and they looked at each other with everything that was between them held quietly in that small contact. Benjamin Doyle, the register said. Mabel Leland Doyle. The names were clear and clean on the page. After the wedding and a reception at the Red Spur that went considerably later than was strictly proper for a Wednesday evening, they walked home in the April dark through a town that still had snow on the mountain peaks above it but was warming at its lower edges, the cottonwoods beginning to bud, the creek running clear and cold from the snowmelt. "Benjamin Doyle," she said as they walked, trying his name out in the way she had that first Sunday at the coffee table. "Mabel Doyle," he said, trying hers. She leaned against his arm. "I like that," she said. "So do I," he said. They came to the adobe on the south end of the street, and he had put a lamp on in the window before they left for the church that morning, and the light was still burning, warm and steady in the dark, and he stopped on the path and looked at it and felt something complete and unbreakable settle in his chest. "Home," he said, quietly. She put her arm through his and stood beside him looking at the lamp in the window. "Home," she agreed. The year that followed was the kind of year that people look back on as a hinge, the year that everything finally faced the right direction. Benjamin took on more surveying work, because word had traveled in the county that he was thorough and principled, and could be trusted to do the work accurately without shading his results to benefit whoever hired him, which was not as common as it should have been. Mabel expanded the store's supply lines through her own negotiations, not Garrett Hale's, and added a small selection of books and writing materials that she had wanted to carry for years, and that turned out to be more popular than anyone had predicted. They worked side by side in the particular way of people who have chosen the same life, each in their own domain but the domains touching at their edges, each aware of what the other was doing, each useful to the other in ways that were practical and genuine and not dependent on sentimentality. He still sometimes woke in the night with the old tension in his chest, the instinct to check exits, the reflex of a man accustomed to needing to leave. It took longer than he expected for that to fully ease. But when it happened now, he would lie still in the dark of the adobe and listen to Mabel's quiet breathing beside him and the wind off the mountain and the small sounds of the territory night, and he would think, "I am here. I chose this name and this town and this woman, and none of it is going to be taken from me." And then he would go back to sleep. His brother James was caught in early 1885 by a federal marshal in Colorado and was sentenced to 8 years in Leavenworth, which closed a chapter that Benjamin had long kept half open in the back of his mind. He told Mabel about it the evening he heard the news, sitting at the kitchen table of the adobe with coffee between them and the fire going well against the January cold. She listened and then was quiet and then said, "How do you feel about it?" "Relieved," he said, "which I feel guilty about." "Don't," she said. "Relieved that it's over, that the running is finished and there's nothing following you anymore. That's not a thing to feel guilty about. That's the right response to something genuinely ending." "He's my brother," Benjamin said, "regardless of anything else." "I know," she said. "You can feel that too. Both things can be true." He looked at her across the table in the firelight. After a year of marriage, he was still catching himself surprised by her, by the quality of her thinking, by the specific way she held complicated truths without trying to simplify them into something easier but less accurate. "Both things are true," he said. "Then hold both of them," she said. "You're big enough to carry that." He reached across the table and took her hand and held it and did not say anything more. And the fire crackled, and the wind came down off the Sangre de Cristos, and outside Calhoun Flats went about its winter evening. And inside the adobe on the south end of the street, a man sat with the woman he loved, and held the complicated truth of where he had come from alongside the uncomplicated truth of where he was now. Mabel's pregnancy was confirmed that spring by the town's doctor, a newly arrived man named Dr. Aaron Whitfield, who had come from Cincinnati with a medical degree and a determination to practice medicine in the territory. He was young and somewhat formal and very competent, and Mabel liked him immediately because he talked to her as though she were a full participant in the medical process, rather than simply the vessel for it, which was not universal among doctors of the era, and which she made a point of appreciating. Benjamin took the news with a stillness that Mabel read correctly as the deepest kind of feeling. He sat down at the kitchen table when she told him, which was unusual because he did not tend to sit down in the middle of the day, and he put his face in his hands for a moment, and then looked up at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded. "Are you all right?" He said first which was the right question, and she said she was well and felt well, and Dr. Whitfield was confident about the November timing. Then he said very quietly, "I'm going to be someone's father." "You are," she said. "I've thought about that," he said. "What kind of father I want to be." She sat down across from him. "Tell me." He thought about it carefully, which was his way. "Someone who asks what they want," he said. "Not someone who decides what they should be and then points them in that direction. Someone who listens first." She looked at him with her eyes soft. "You already know exactly how to do that," she said. "You've been doing it for 2 years." He looked down at his hands on the table and then up at her. "I've had a good teacher," he said. She reached across and put her hand on his jaw, and he turned his face into her palm like someone taking warmth from a fire, and she thought that this was the truest thing she knew, that this man who had come into her store running from a name had become, in the choosing of one, the most genuinely himself person she had ever known. The summer of 1885 brought changes to Calhoun Flats. The railroad survey had come through the previous year, indicating that a branch line might come through the valley within 3 years, and the prospect of the railroad brought new settlers and new commerce, and a new kind of ambition to the town. Benjamin's surveying skills became particularly valued, as land claims needed to be properly filed and verified before the railroad's arrival made the valley more contested. He did this work carefully and always with Mabel's voice in his ear about what surveying law was for and what it could be weaponized to do. He was careful about which clients he worked for and careful to document everything properly so there could be no accusation of partial work. When there were conflicts between homesteaders and the larger land interests that were beginning to move in ahead of the railroad, he was not neutral, which was professionally risky, but which he considered morally required. He lost 2 paying contracts over it and gained the respect of 3 families whose land claims he had accurately marked against the interests of people trying to displace them, and he thought that was the right trade. Eli Leland, by midsummer of 1885, had begun a courtship of his own, with a young woman named Clara Vasquez, whose family ran sheep on a tract of land northwest of town. Clara's family had been in the territory since before it was territory, part of the old New Mexico families whose presence predated American legal jurisdiction, and who navigated the complicated politics of territorial land law with a patience born of long experience. Mabel was delighted by Clara in a way that went beyond mere approval. She genuinely liked her, appreciated her steadiness and her humor and the frank way she engaged with the world. Benjamin and Eli sat on the porch of the adobe one August evening, while Mabel and Clara were inside talking and laughing about something neither man would fully understand, and Eli said, "How do you do it? The asking someone to stay." Benjamin looked at the evening sky for a moment. "I didn't ask her to stay," he said. "I asked her to let me stay. There's a difference." Eli was quiet, absorbing this. She had already built her life here, Benjamin said. She was already planted. I was the one asking to be taken in. I think when you're the one doing the asking, you come to it with some humility about that. Eli picked up his coffee cup. That's useful, he said. It's honest, Benjamin said. Same thing, usually. Their son was born on the 15th of November, 1885, which was a clear, cold night with the stars very bright over the valley and a full moon laying silver light across the mesa. Dr. Whitfield was there, and Mrs. Alderman was there because she had placed herself there by force of personality, and because she had delivered enough babies in her time to be genuinely useful. And Eli sat in the front room of the adobe, looking at the fire with the expression of a man enduring something he had no tool for. Benjamin was in the room with Mabel because he had told Dr. Whitfield he would be, and Dr. Whitfield, who was forward-thinking for his era, had not argued. He held her hand through the labor, and he did not look away from anything, and he spoke to her steadily with whatever came to mind, sometimes practical things, and sometimes the names of things he could see through the window, the moon and the mesa and the cottonwood trees stripped bare for winter, and sometimes simply her name, Mabel, over and over like it was the center of something, which it was. The child came into the world at 11 at night and filled the adobe with a sound that Benjamin had not been prepared for, not the specific cry of it but the fact of it, the fact that a person was here who had not been here, a whole new person in the world with a whole future ahead and a name yet to be chosen. They named him Thomas, which was Benjamin's father's name but which they reclaimed with full intention, understanding that a name could carry more than one meaning and that the same name in different hands was a different thing. Thomas Eli Doyle, with Eli for the uncle who had been, after everything, Benjamin's first friend in Calhoun Flats. Eli wept when they told him, which surprised him and did not surprise Mabel at all. Thomas was a good infant, and then a good toddler, and then a good small boy, in the way of children who are simply made of the right material from the start. He had his mother's directness and his father's careful observation, and the combination of the two was, from very early on, formidable in a way that made both parents look at each other sometimes with expressions that were 3 parts proud and 1 part mildly alarmed. By the spring of 1887, the ranch and the town had settled into something that felt, to both of them, like the particular piece of things properly established. The railroad had indeed come through, as the survey had predicted, and with it came a new energy to Calhoun Flats and a new prosperity that expanded the town's commercial life considerably. Mabel expanded the store to double its original size, using the building next door which she bought outright from a departing freighter, and she stocked it with a wider range of goods and hired a young woman named Rose Garrett to help with the counter work, so that she was not managing everything alone with a toddler at her feet. Benjamin's surveying practice had grown into a proper business, with 2 regular assistants and a county contract for the official land record work that no longer needed to be handled by the county seat 30 miles away. He had an office, a real one, in a building he shared with the town's new asher, and he came home in the evenings with ink on his hands and the particular tiredness of someone who has worked hard at something that matters. And Mabel thought there was no more satisfying thing to witness than a person doing the work they were built for. Eli married Clara Vasquez in the spring of 1887, in a ceremony that combined the Vasquez family's Catholic tradition with the Protestant Church's simple blessing, in a way that was slightly improvised but wholly sincere, and which Reverend Alderman handled with exactly the flexibility of spirit that made him the right minister for a territory town. Benjamin stood up for Eli, and Clara's 3 aunts sat in the front pew and wept with the focused intensity of women who took the proper ceremonial expression of feeling very seriously. Thomas, who was a year and a half old and mobile and interested in everything, was managed through the ceremony by Mrs. Alderman, who had at this point appointed herself the Doyle family's honorary grandmother, and would have been offended by any suggestion that this was not an official role. That evening, after the wedding dinner and the dancing that went on the porch of the Vasquez family's homestead under the spring stars, Benjamin and Mabel sat together on the edge of the porch away from the dancing and watched the territory night and listened to the music and the voices and the laughter. Thomas was asleep inside, transferred to a makeshift bed by Mrs. Alderman with the firm efficiency she applied to all logistical matters. "Do you remember," Mabel said, "the first time you came into the store?" "I came in for coffee and flour and salt pork," he said. "You did," she said, "and you fixed my shelf. The nail was inadequate." "It was," she said, "and then you asked me to have coffee with you sometime, which I thought was quite bold for a man who had barely said a dozen words previously." "I surprised myself," he said. She leaned against him and he put his arm around her and the music played on and the stars were very thick and bright above the valley. "You surprised me every day," she said quietly. "From the beginning. Every time I thought I had a full picture of you, there was more." He turned to look at her profile in the darkness, the line of her face that he had come to know as well as his own hands. "Is that a complaint?" he asked. She laughed, the real laugh, the one that had been rearranging his understanding of things since that first morning in the general store. "It's the best thing I know," she said. He pressed his lips against her temple, against the pieces of hair that were, inevitably, escaping their pins even at a wedding, and she turned her face up, and he kissed her properly under the spring stars while the music played and Calhoun Flats danced around them. In 1888, Mabel told him she was expecting their second child, and this time he did not sit down. He pulled her into his arms right there in the kitchen and held her with the full weight of his feeling, and she laughed against his shoulder and said she was glad he was more prepared this time. The second child, born in August of 1888, was a girl, and they named her Anna Rose, for no one in particular but because both names were soft and definite in equal measure, which seemed right for a child who arrived in the world with a determined expression, and her mother's dark eyes, and the particular quality, even at a few hours old, of looking at everything around her with that careful cataloging attention that her father had never entirely lost. Thomas was nearly 3 and regarded his new sister with the evaluating seriousness of someone meeting a colleague. He poked her hand and she grabbed his finger with unexpected grip, and he looked up at Benjamin with an expression of genuine surprise, and Benjamin laughed until he had to put a hand on the door frame to stay upright. "She is strong," Thomas said with complete seriousness. "She is," Benjamin agreed. "She is very strong." "Like Mama," Thomas said. Benjamin looked at Mabel, who was exhausted and flushed and more beautiful than anything he had a right to be in the presence of. "Exactly like Mama," he said. The years settled and deepened around them with the particular quality of time passing inside a life that is genuinely inhabited, not merely occupied. The store grew and the surveying business grew and the children grew, and the town of Calhoun Flats grew with them, developing slowly from a trade route settlement into a proper small town with 2 churches and a proper school, and a newspaper that came out twice weekly, and a community that was, like all communities, imperfect and argumentative and capable of great kindness. Thomas started school in the fall of 1890 and was, unsurprisingly, extraordinary at reading and maddening at sitting still, a combination that his teacher, a patient woman named Mrs. Croft, described to Mabel as both challenging and deeply gratifying. Anna, when she was old enough to follow her brother to the schoolhouse, was quieter and more methodical, and had a particular gift for mathematics that made Dr. Whitfield, who had stayed in Calhoun Flats and become a genuine friend to the family, say that she should have every opportunity to pursue it, which Mabel agreed with fully. Eli and Clara had a son in 1888, a month after Anna was born, and named him Felipe after Clara's grandfather, and the two families wove together over the years in the way of people who share an actual history. Sunday dinners that migrated between houses. The children growing up together. The particular comfort of being known by people who had witnessed how you arrived and who had stayed through all of it. There was a night in the summer of 1891 when Thomas was 5 and Anna not yet 3, and the territory was in the grip of a heat that had been building for 2 weeks without breaking, when Benjamin woke at 3 in the morning and lay in the heat, and listened to the night sounds and thought, with a fullness that was almost painful, about who he had been 8 years ago riding into this valley on a tired horse with a name that didn't fit and nowhere certain to put his feet. He had come here running. He had run so far and so hard from a name that when someone had simply asked him what name he wanted, he had been entirely undone by the question, had not known what to do with it, had not had a ready answer because no one had ever asked. He lay in the dark and listened to Mabel's quiet breathing beside him and to the small sounds of his children from across the hall and to the hot summer wind in the cottonwood trees and thought, Benjamin Doyle, father, husband, surveyor, citizen of Calhoun Flats, New Mexico Territory. That was his name, every part of it. He had chosen all of it and it fit. In the morning he rose early and made coffee and stood in the kitchen door looking out at the mesa in the pre-dawn blue, and Mabel came and stood beside him in her nightgown with her hair loose, and he handed her his cup because her hands were empty, and she took it and leaned against the door frame and looked out at the same sky. "You're awake early," she said. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Just thinking." She looked at him sideways. "Good thinking or difficult thinking?" "Good," he said. "The best kind." She handed back the cup and he took it, and they stood together in the kitchen door while the sky moved from blue to gold, and the territory morning came on with all its characteristic extravagance of light, painting the mesa in colors that had no proper names, and the cottonwood trees along the creek went silver in the early wind, and somewhere down the street someone's rooster announced the day with full conviction. "I owe you something," he said. She looked at him. "What's that?" "I've thought about it for years," he said. "How to say it properly." She waited, which was her way. "You asked me what name I wanted," he said. "The first time I told you my name. I didn't know at the time how much that question was going to mean to me. I don't know if I understood it fully, but I've thought about it every day since. That you asked and that whatever I said you were going to accept, no conditions, no requirement to explain it." He paused. "You gave me permission to be who I was trying to be, not who I'd been born. I didn't know a person could give that to another person until you did it." She was very still beside him. "So thank you," he said, "for asking the right question." She turned to look at him, and her expression was open and complete in everything that was hers. The directness and the warmth and the occasional escaping hair and the steady dark eyes that had looked at him from the very beginning as though there was someone worth seeing. "I just asked your name," she said softly. "You asked what name I wanted," he said. "That was everything." She reached up and put her hand against his face, and he turned into it the same way he always had, the way he always would, the gesture that was entirely automatic and entirely true. "Benjamin Doyle," she said softly, the way she had said it that very first Sunday morning over coffee in the Red Spur when she was trying it out. Just his name, just 2 words and everything in them. "Mabel Doyle," he said back the same way. The sun came fully over the mesa edge and lit the valley in gold, and the day began. And inside the adobe on the south end of the main street of Calhoun Flats, a man stood in his kitchen door with his wife and his coffee and his name, every one of them properly chosen and properly kept, and he thought that this was what it meant to arrive somewhere. Not the riding in, not the stopping, but the morning after the morning after the morning, standing in the ordinary light, knowing where you were. Thomas came running down the hall at that moment in his nightshirt, demanding to know if there was going to be flapjacks, which there was, and Anna was not far behind him making a sound that was not quite a word, but was clearly an opinion. And the morning organized itself around breakfast, and the particular beautiful noise of children, and the smell of coffee and salt pork in the kitchen. And outside the September heat was lifting at last, and a new coolness was coming down off the mountains, and the territory spread out around the town in all its vast red and gold indifference, under a sky so blue it was almost impossible, going on and on and on above everything, immense and unchanged and quietly magnificent. Benjamin Doyle stood in the middle of it and was entirely, completely, absolutely home. The years that followed were full in every sense of the word. The store continued to grow under Mabel's careful stewardship, and she eventually added a small postal contract to the operation, because the territorial post service had been inconsistent, and the town needed it done reliably, which meant she was now the postmistress as well as the general store proprietor, a combination of responsibilities that she managed with the same organized thoroughness she applied to everything. Thomas grew into a boy who was full of opinions and questions, the kind of child who could not be in a room without becoming its center, not from selfishness, but from a genuine interest in everything and everyone around him. He had his mother's way with people and his father's observational patience, and the combination meant that by the age of 8 he was conducting negotiations between the other children at the schoolhouse that Mrs. Croft described as both impressive and occasionally unnecessary. Anna was quieter and deeper, a child who thought at length before she spoke and whose conclusions, when she offered them, were usually both accurate and surprising. She was her father's shadow on Saturday mornings when he worked in his survey office, sitting on a stool beside his drawing table and asking careful questions about maps and measurements and the way lines on paper corresponded to land in the world. And Benjamin answered every question with full seriousness because she deserved it, and because her questions were, frequently, the best ones he received all week. Eli and Clara's family expanded too, with a daughter named Rosaria in 1890 and another son named Daniel in 1892, and the extended family that had formed around the two households was a real community of its own. People who argued about Sunday dinner contributions and laughed at shared jokes and knew each other's stories. Mrs. Alderman, who had been their honorary grandmother through all of it, died quietly in her sleep in the winter of 1892 at the age of 70, and the loss of her was a genuine one. She had been strict about mealtimes and firm about drinking in the rooms and completely inflexible about her affection for the people she considered hers, and Benjamin carried her in his memory as one of the first people in Calhoun Flats who had looked at him without suspicion. At her small grave on the hill behind the church, which had been finished for years now and had proper pews and a working organ, Benjamin stood with his hat in his hands and thought that she was one of the names on the list he had expanded, the list of what he allowed himself to want and value and hold. She had been on it from early on, even when he hadn't fully acknowledged it. He squeezed Mabel's hand and she squeezed back, and beside them Thomas stood solemn and Anna held her father's other hand, and the winter sky was very large over the valley, and the mountains stood at their edges as they always had, old and permanent and entirely unconcerned with human grief, which was somehow comforting. Life in Calhoun Flats in the early 1890s was also shaped by the larger changes moving through the territory. The question of New Mexico statehood was a constant conversation, getting closer and then further and then closer again, as the politics in Washington went through their cycles. Benjamin had opinions on this that were carefully formed and practically grounded, based on his direct experience with how territorial land law had been used to strip families of property that was rightfully theirs, particularly families whose older Spanish land grant claims intersected with newer American legal frameworks in contentious ways. He began, in 1892, to write occasional letters to the territorial newspaper in Santa Fe, letters about survey law and land rights, and the specific injustices that came from the gaps between what the law said and what actually happened in the territory. He did this under his own name, Benjamin Doyle, which was a choice he made deliberately and which Mabel supported with the full weight of her opinion. "If you say important things, say them with your name attached," she told him, which was the kind of thing she said with the natural authority of someone who had been saying true things under her own name her entire adult life. The letters were received well enough that the Santa Fe paper ran several of them, and this led to a correspondence with a lawyer in Albuquerque named Everett Marsh, who was working on land rights cases, and who wanted Benjamin's technical expertise in documentation. Benjamin worked 3 cases with Everett Marsh over the following 2 years, providing the survey documentation that supported the land claims of families who had been challenged by outside interests trying to take advantage of legal confusion. He won 2 of them cleanly, and the third was settled in partial favor, which was better than those families had expected. He did not make much money at it. He made the right kind of satisfaction, which was the currency that mattered. By 1893, when Thomas was 7 and Anna was 4 and Mabel was expecting their 3rd child, and the spring was coming fast off the mountains with a warmth that felt like a promise being kept, Benjamin Doyle looked at his life and found it impossible to account for fully, not because it was complicated, but because it was more than he had ever permitted himself to imagine. He had built the adobe on the south end of the street himself, replacing the rented structure with something he owned, expanding it room by room as the family required. He had planted a kitchen garden behind it that Mabel had taken over with the organizational energy she applied to all things, turning it into a proper kitchen garden with raised beds and proper irrigation channels, which Thomas helped with and Anna supervised with an expression of intense concern. He had a business that was his and a reputation that was earned and a name that was chosen. And beside him through all of it was the woman who had given him the question that had made all of it possible. The 3rd child was a boy, born in October 1893, and they named him Eli after the uncle who had become Benjamin's brother in every sense that counted, which made the actual Eli Leland cry for the 2nd time in their acquaintance, and which he handled with considerably more composure than the first time, which Mabel noted with the gentle amusement of a sister who has been watching her brother grow up her entire life. The child's full name was Eli James Doyle. The James was deliberate and Benjamin's, and when Mabel asked him about it in the quiet evening after the baby had been put down and the other children were asleep, he said, "Because he deserves a name that's been reclaimed. Not abandoned." She looked at him across the table and said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "You are the most careful person I have ever known." "Careful," he said. "With people," she said. "With names and what they mean and what they carry. You think about those things more carefully than anyone." She paused. "I think because you know what it costs when they're not handled with care." He looked at his hands on the table, the surveyor's hands, ink-stained at the edges, strong from fencing and carpentry and years of work. "Maybe," he said. "Not maybe," she said, and stood up and came around the table and put her hands on his shoulders, and he reached up and covered one of her hands with his, and the lamp on the table made the kitchen gold, and outside the autumn territory was settling into its quiet night, and the baby slept, and the children slept, and the town breathed steadily around the house. "I love you," he said, not for the first time, but with the weight of a man who means it in every way a person can mean 3 words. "I want you to know I understand what you gave me, from the beginning, what you asked and what you accepted." She came around to sit beside him rather than behind him and looked at his face with the full attention that was her greatest gift to him, the act of actually seeing someone completely. "You gave yourself to me, Benjamin," she said. "That's what I have. You chose to be here, chose to stay, chose to be who you are. I didn't give you that, you built that." "You asked the right question," he said. "You had the right answer," she said. "You just needed someone to ask." They sat together at the kitchen table in the lamplight while the territory night went on outside, immense and old and full of stars, and the life they had built together sat around them in every detail. The children's boots by the door, the shelf of books, the careful map on the wall that Benjamin had drawn of the valley and its survey lines and all the claims properly marked, The jar of cottonwood seeds that Anna had collected in the spring and kept on the windowsill because she thought they were interesting, the coffee pot on the stove, the smell of wood smoke and soap. All of it chosen, all of it kept. In the years that came after, Calhoun Flats became a proper town, with a proper school that Thomas eventually attended for all his years, and from which he departed at 17 with a scholarship to a school in Albuquerque, arranged partly through Mabel's persistence, and partly through the Territorial Education Fund that Benjamin had written letters advocating for. Anna went to school in Santa Fe at 15, in a program for young women in mathematics and science that Dr. Whitfield had found and Mabel had written to, and which Anna herself had wanted with the particular focused wanting of someone who knows exactly what they're built for. She came home for summers and holidays, and was always her father's daughter in the best possible way, full of careful questions and exact answers. Young Eli grew up between his parents and his namesake uncle and Clara and their cousins, and the full warm community of a family that had been carefully and honestly built, and he had the quality of someone who had never known the weight of a name that didn't fit, which was, Benjamin thought, the best inheritance he could have passed on. Benjamin Doyle's reputation as a surveyor and as a man of principle in land rights matters spread beyond Calhoun Flats in those years, and he occasionally traveled to other towns for contract work, but he always came home and was always glad to. He had learned, a long time ago on a March morning in Kansas, that a man could not build anything worth having from the back of a horse at speed. Building required staying, required planting your feet in one ground and letting it hold you. He and Mabel, in the long evenings of those years, developed the habit of walking after supper when the weather allowed, out past the end of the main street and along the creek path under the cottonwood trees, which were enormous now, old and certain in the landscape. They walked in the fall when the trees went gold, and in the spring when they went green, and in the summer when the light went on until 9 at night. And they talked about everything, about their children and the town's business, and the territory's politics, and the books they were reading, and the things they remembered, and sometimes about nothing in particular, just the comfortable narration of people who have been paying attention to the same life for a long time. In the spring of 1896, walking along the creek in the new green of May, Mabel stopped and looked up at the cottonwood trees, which were going into full leaf, and said, "Do you remember the first time you saw these trees?" "I remember riding in from the east," he said, stopping beside her. "I smelled them before I saw them. Water, green things. I thought this might be the place." She looked at him sideways with that look. And was it? He looked at the trees and the creek and the valley and the mountains and everything that was his life. "You know the answer to that," he said. She took his hand and they walked on under the cottonwood trees in the May light, and the creek ran cold and clear beside them, and the valley spread out in every direction, and above it the sky was the pure impossible blue of the New Mexico territory on a spring afternoon, and it went on and on and on, enormous and permanent and full of light, over everything that had been built and planted and named and chosen and kept. Benjamin Doyle walked in it with the full weight of who he was, every part of that name, every year of that name, every morning of waking up in the life he had built with the woman beside him, and he thought of the tired horse and the March road and the east and the running, and he thought of the bell above the door and the wavy glass window, and the woman with the escaping hair who had looked up from her ledger and eventually asked him, quietly and without requirement, what name he wanted. He thought, "I want to be called home. I want to be called here. I want to be called yours." He had been every day since. He would be every day that followed. That was the whole of it, and it was enough, and it was everything, and it was good.